Stand by for broadcast.
You're listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations.
Hi, I'm Flight Lieutenant Chris Solly and welcome to the latest RAF Inside Air podcast. In this episode, we'll step behind the scenes at the Air Historical Branch at Northolt to check out the huge variety of work they undertake, going back through time, and also in making sure that today's RAF events are properly captured for the future.
We get material from the air staff on sort of current policy. We will also, where there has been an operation, we will also try and gather material, again, much of it now digital. We have to try and interpret all those and go back to people saying this is what this record of service contains, and of course we'll also tell them what the guy did. So these days we may well write a classified version, but we will then look very closely at it and produce an unclassified or occasionally OS classification version.
As usual, we'll also reheat a few stories which could have slipped under your radar, and we'll be finding out who's under the hat this week with AS1 Ben Russell.
The proudest moment of my RAF career was planning and delivering a media event for the last known Battle of Britain pilot, Paddy Hemingway, in Dublin, Ireland.
Welcome to the latest edition of Inside Air. This time we're looking at the work of the Air Historical Branch based at RAF Northolt, finding out what does happen there, what doesn't happen there, and who can tell us more. Seb Cox, who is the head of the Air Historical Branch. Welcome to Inside Air, Seb. First of all, first question, right at basics, what is the Air Historical Branch and what does it actually do?
Well, Air Historical Branch, or AHB for short, is the RAF's internal history office. So I work directly for the air staff. My boss is a one-star officer down in town. Above him, it's the current Assistant Chief of Air Staff, and above her, it's the Chief. So we work for the air staff. We're the RAF's internal history office, and we have many roles and responsibilities, and doubtless we can discuss those as we go on.
The moment we mention the word history, people can jump to a conclusion that it's dusty books in a dusty library and it's stuff from years ago. That is the case, but it's much more than that, isn't it?
It is. Essentially, in my view, history starts this morning. So, today there's a significant election going on in the United States, and obviously that's a historic event and will be recorded in history. Well, exactly the same is true of what the RAF does. Everything it does becomes history the moment it happens. That doesn't mean that we don't go right back to 1918 if necessary. We do. But a lot of what we concentrate on is essentially much more recent. So the last 20 years are the principal, though not the only focus of a lot of what we do.
So for somebody listening to this at the moment thinking it's all lovely, but it's not really relevant to me, if you're serving at the moment, part of the contribution you're making is the history of the future. In other words, you use the phrase yourself, today's news, tomorrow's history.
Yep, absolutely that. One of the things which a lot of the RAF may be familiar with is the Form 540 Operations Record Book. And the Form 540, which every RAF unit has to submit every month, is in fact the one of the base documents that the Air Historical Branch uses to actually to research and write the histories that we produce. So although I'm well aware that units out there think that the 540 is a pain in the proverbial, it's actually a very important document because it's the only document from a unit around the Air Force which is absolutely guaranteed to survive and will end up in the UK National Archives in 20 years' time when anybody, including future historians, can go and read it. So the record of what a unit does, the base document for any unit in the Air Force and its history is the Operations Record Book. And that goes right back to before the Second World War, and all of those operations record books from units in the Second World War, 617, the Dam Busters Squadron's Form 540 Ops record book is at queue. Anybody can go and read it. And you will find that all these historians who write erudite histories of the dam busters will have gone to Kew and looked at the ops record book. And in 25 years' time, people wanting to look at ops shader or whatever will have to go to Kew, and they will start with the ops record books of the squadrons, etc.
So what you mentioned the Form 540 being very much the backbone of what you receive. What else? What other source material gets sent to you?
Well, we receive digital, it's nearly all digital now, digital material from the air staff, from the assistant chief downwards through the 1-star I referred to. So we get material from the air staff on sort of current policy. We will also, where there has been an operation, we will also try and gather material, again, much of it now digital. We will gather material. So my archivist, we call it in AHB fishing. He goes looking for material in people's work areas, and sometimes we obviously have to get permission to go and look, but we will go and look, and we will lift stuff and archive it digitally here at AHB if we think it's relevant and of sufficient interest. So it works both ways. We actively go and hunt for material, and also people do automatically send us material. But the easiest way to do it, actually, which is what happens with the air staff, is they grant us access digitally to their work areas, and my archivist goes and he goes fishing.
Fishing expeditions, I'm liking that. Presumably, lots of the source material that you're getting is, as you mentioned, it's current, it's classified. From a security point of view, who decides what can be made public and what can be used just for internal use at this stage?
Generally speaking, we adhere to the original classification on a document. We won't change it. The only ways it gets changed, there are two ways generally that it will get changed. One is at around about the 18-year point, it will go to the mod record reviewers, and they will look at it and decide whether it can be downgraded to unclassified and released into the public domain. The alternative method is we are subject to the Freedom of Information Act, and people can apply to see material under FOI. And the mere fact that it bears a classification is not in and of itself a reason to deny somebody access under the Freedom of Information Act. So then we would have to assess whether it is releasable, and we would probably, in that instance, talk to the originator of the document and say, is this still sensitive, etc. So just as an example, we've we get requests from people asking to look at aircrew manuals for aircraft that are no longer in service. So we may or may not grant them access to those aircrew manuals. So just as an example, Jaguar is now out of service. But we would also look at, it may be out of service with the RAF, but is it out of service with all our allied air forces?
And Tornado is a great example of that. It's still being used elsewhere.
Yeah.
And the Harrier.
And the Harrier, indeed. So we would almost certainly refuse access to a Harrier manual, not least because we sold them all to the Americans.
Absolutely. We've talked a little bit about some of the material you receive. Let's have a dig into some of the histories that you've been working on. Let's start with shader operations. Yeah.
Well, we look at the great majority of operations that the Air Force has undertaken over the last 50 years since the Second World War, if we go back far enough in AHB. So, but the ones we've worked on more recently have been, we've looked at the history of shader. We looked at both combat air and ISR in shader. We tend now, 25 years ago when I first came to this post, we would just write a classified history, and we would distribute it around the Air Force, and we know what happened to it. It would go into somebody's 6x4 steel cabinet. It would be recorded in their confidential document register, and they'd take it out once a year and dust it off when the RAF police asked them to account for all classified documents, and then they put it back again and lock the cupboard. So we decided that was not an ideal way to get the information out to people. So these days we may well write a classified version, but we will then look very closely at it and produce an unclassified or occasionally OS classification version. And that,
just for those who don't know, OS being
official sensitive, it's the lowest level of classification. It used to be called restricted years ago. But generally, we'll go for unclassified. We'll print a certain number of copies, physically print in hard copy. But we also have a website. And if anybody wants to Google Air Historical Branch narratives, they can find all the unclassified narratives that we've written. And indeed, they can find copies of some of those Second World War and post-war narratives, which were originally classified, but are now being declassified and anybody can go read them. So, if you want to go and read the original secret AHB narrative of the Battle of Britain, or the Bomber Offensive, or any of the campaigns that the RAF undertook in the Second World War, they're all up on the website. You can go and read them.
Coastal Command, all those things, operations in the Far East, all of those things are there.
Yeah, there's 7 volumes on Coastal Command if you want to go and spend a few weeks reading.
Fabulous stuff. The Balik Corridor, one of the untold stories that's come out in the more recent times. Presumably at the height of Telek and Herrick, you were receiving extraordinary amounts of information and Form 540s.
Yeah. Yep. Units submitted to us, and we also, as I said, we also went looking for other material. If you go back to, Telek was a bit of a watershed in terms of record keeping, and the reason for that was if you go back to the 1991 Gulf War, so Op Granby, we still hold in the archive here. Some of it has now gone into the National Archive of Kew. But when that operation finished, we gathered an awful lot of material, not just the 540s, but Chief of the Air Staff's file, the Operate Commander's files out in the Gulf, and so on. And that occupied about 50 shelf meters. We measure physical documents by shelf meterage. So if you have a shelf meter full, then that's what it says. Well, if you stretch out 50 shelf meters, you get 50 meters in a line of documentary archive boxes, essentially. We still hold about 2.9 shelf kilometers of classified records in AHB. That's physical. Obviously, a lot now is digital, and that's measured obviously in terabytes and whatever type of byte you want to call it these days. But yeah, there's still a vault in AHB with physical documentation, and we still print off material as well. There are 2 reasons for that. Nobody is entirely sure that you'll be able to read everything in the future if it was produced originally with a certain type of software. So on occasions, if we're not convinced that it'll survive and be accessible, then we'll print it off, because we know how long paper will last, which is, if you look after it properly, is centuries. A lot of stuff was sent on 3.5-inch floppy drives and then on CDs. Well, we still have a 3.5-inch floppy drive in AHB, and we still have some CDs. The reckoning is that a CD, even a gold-plated CD, will not last more than 20 years. So, just as an example, the then Strike Commander around the turn of the century went for a system called Canafile, which was a sort of glorified optical character reader, and they put all their paper files through this thing and then shredded the files, and then Canon stopped supporting Canafile. Fortunately, a wise old warrant officer downloaded lots of the material from Strike onto CD and sent it to us. we have been taking it off CDs, and to illustrate the problem I was talking about, we have an old LNX computer in a corner of the vault which runs Windows 95.
Wow.
Because that's what you need to get at the stuff on Canifile. But each page on Canifile was recorded as individual JPEG. So a file of 100 pages, that was 100 JPEGs. So my poor archivist has spent several years reconstituting these files one JPEG at a time.
The irony, in a way, that you have to future-proof things by reaching back so far with technology.
I know, but it is one of the things we have to think about.
Beyond operations, beyond the evolving role that everyone's involved with, one consistent thing that we will live with in the military is defence reviews. Do you keep records on that kind of thing as well?
Yes, we do. And that's, of course, one of the things we get from the air staff. And it works both ways. So we're currently writing a whole series of histories, and we've got up to around about the turn of the century, having started in the 1980s. Although we do have histories going back further than that we've written, but the current program started in the 80s, and we've got up to just the turn of the century. So we've produced 2 volumes so far covering that period in the 80s and 90s. There's another one in draft covering the late 90s into the early 2000s, and we will go on right up to the current defence review time. But when I say that works both ways, so the chief did ask us for an abbreviated sort of version in terms of he wanted about a 10,000 word explanation of the impact of defence reviews on the RAF over the last 40 odd years. So as part of that series that we're writing, we produced that for him to inform him and his team of approaches that were taken in previous defence reviews, and to put it bluntly, how successful or otherwise they might have been. But obviously that is valuable to the current team, looking at how they're going to deal with Lord Robertson and the Labour government's current look at defence.
So informing future policy by looking back in time as well. We've talked a little bit about some of the public-facing records. Who is able to come to the Air Historical Branch and access that information, and how do they do that?
Well, if somebody wants to come and see us, they have to write to us. They can either drop us an email, phone us up, or send a letter to RAF Northolt. We'll look at what they want to come and have a look at. We'll decide whether A, we have some material that would be helpful and of interest. B, whether it could be accessed more easily somewhere else, so either at the RAF Museum or at Kew at the National Archives. Because being on an operational base, they'd still have to get through the guard room, they'd have to be given a pass, and we'd have to come and escort them and so on. Now, we don't mind doing that if that's justifiable for what they want to look at, and we're holding it, we'll do that. But if it's easier just to say, well, actually, you can go down to Kew, or you can go to Hendon to the RAF Museum and you can see it there, then we'll tell them, because it's just easier for them, easier for us. But we will always, make ourselves available to people if they need to come and look at material that we hold. So, we've had some fairly well-known names come to ASB in the past. We've had Sir Max Hastings here. We've had Anthony Beaver here. We've had James Holland here. We've had Richard Overy, Professor Richard Overy. I could go on naming names and name dropping. That's
the top level. That's, as you say, Max Hastings, Paul Beaver, those guys. But presumably, as people research their family histories, and more people are doing that with online resources, people come across an RAF connection, maybe somebody who was a casualty back in the day and they don't know too much about it. Can they come to you for that sort of information?
They can certainly, and they do, and we're very happy to deal with them. They certainly write to us. So we get about 1,500 written inquiries a year. That's emails and letters. And we deal with all RAF casualty inquiries from more than about 10 years ago. About 80 to 90% of them still relate to the Second World War. And if people write in, when I first started working in AHB, and embarrassingly a long time ago, it tended to be the either the wartime generation itself, so brothers and sisters, occasional widows even saying, we want to know what happened to Fred in the war. And often they would write and say, we were never told what happened. And that was particularly true of the sons and daughters. We were only ever told that Dad was killed in the war. Actually, we still have access to all the RAF casualty files from the Second World War, and families were always told everything that the RAF knew about how a man killed, right down to the letters, even in the war, would say he was on a Lancaster, shot down on a raid to Berlin. They would even give the target. So, but that generation, it was very much the stiff upper lip generation. So, and they used to internalize these things. We don't do that anymore. So even the widow would say, well, all I know is he died, on this day. And they would not tell the next generation what they knew because they were internalizing it stiff upper lip, and it just wasn't the done thing to explain precisely what was known and what happened.
Things have moved on a lot, and the AHB fitting into that. One of the exciting projects that you and the team are working on is working with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and obviously history literally being unearthed as building work goes on. What sort of help are you able to provide to them, and what sort of things do you do with that?
Well, still to this day, aircraft wreckage is unearthed. It's often overseas. So we've recently, and last week, we've been advised by the air attaché in Germany that the Germans have discovered the remains of a Lancaster with human remains still in it. These aircraft obviously often went in from 20,000 feet or whatever, and although bodies would be recovered by the Germans, and indeed post-war there was also attempts to recover people, even went on into the early 50s. But maybe they're building a supermarket or whatever, and in digging the foundations out, they do come across material of that nature. So we've got a Lancaster in Germany, and the French are extending a canal in northern France, and they've unearthed the remains of a Hurricane. So we're not entirely sure at this point whether they have found some human remains, but we happen to know that some remains from that individual were recovered at the time. So he does have a grave, but now one of the things that will almost certainly happen with that is that they'll open up the grave and add the additional remains in a additional smaller coffin and reseal the grave. But we need to look at who we think it might be. Then we liaise with both the Joint Casualty and Compassionate Cell in the Centre in the MOD and the CWGC. JCCC will look for relatives to do a DNA test to try and prove that it is who we think it is. And then the CWGC will arrange for proper burial, and the RAF will send a burial party and a bugler and etc. and a padre. And that's how it works. But we also get asked, there are researchers out there who do research RAF losses. And sometimes they come to us or the CWGC and say, we think this grave, which is marked as an unknown flight lieutenant or an unknown airman of the Second World War, often with a date of death on it, they will come to us and say, we think this is Flight Lieutenant Bloggs. So we'll look at those and we will try and determine whether we agree with them or not. Sometimes they will provide a little more information or evidence, and if they do, and we think it all matches up, then we will advise JCCC, and they will ask the CWGC to replace the headstone with a named headstone. So, yeah.
Presumably that must be quite a rewarding part of the job when you're bringing sort of some closure to that 80 years on.
Oh, yeah, it's very rewarding. I mean, it's, one of the problems, to be honest, with some of the researchers is that they set out with the set intention of proving that it's Flight Lieutenant Bloggs. And that's fine, but what they sometimes ignore is, but we can't, is what other flight lieutenants might it be? So we would look at, say we've got a date for a grave, we would look at all the flight lieutenants unknown who have gone missing over a period on either side of the recorded date of death. And that's even made more complicated because, of course, some poor guys went into the sea and their bodies would be washed up on the shore and then buried in a French or Dutch cemetery, wherever, potentially many weeks or months after they were actually shot down and lost. So sometimes we have to look for casualties several months before the burial date. And that just makes it that much more complicated. But you're right. It is, if we can name a grave, we're delighted. And we've just gone to JCCC, accepting a case for 4 guys from a Lancaster from 1944. One of the complexities of this sort of issue is that both ourselves and the Americans went looking for burials of airmen after the war. The RAF established a section called the Missing Research and Inquiry Service, and they went all over the world, actually. They weren't limited to Europe, looking for RAF graves, exhuming them, trying to confirm identities. Then they would be reconcentrated to British military cemetery, Commonwealth War Grave Cemetery, so they can be properly looked after instead of being spread over all churchyards and cemeteries all over the place. And the MRES went on working until the early 1950s, doing exactly that. We still have their reports. Those are on the casualty files. But occasionally, the Americans unfortunately had a habit of, if they got to one of these cemeteries or churchyards first, they tended to take all the bodies away. And they had a different way of doing it. They have, as people may be aware, American military cemeteries in Europe tend to be very much larger than the Commonwealth War Graves. The Americans concentrated them into massive cemeteries. So the most famous, of course, is the one at Omaha Beach that appears at the start of Saving Private Ryan. Well, that has US casualties from all over, not just Normandy, but all over parts of Western France. Whereas the CWGC cemeteries tend to be much smaller. This is not to say that some of them aren't quite large, but they don't go to the same scale as the Americans. But when the Americans took all these bodies away, sometimes they took RAF airmen, and then, of course, they're removed from where they were originally buried, so the location is not obvious, so you can't then link it up so easily to a particular crashed aircraft and what have you. So if the Americans got a body first and then found out it was an RAF guy, that makes our life a bit more difficult.
Amazing stuff. And one of the other aspects that you're involved with AHB is helping people to interpret records of service, whether it's for themselves, their own record of service, or I'm guessing relatives and stuff. They're written in a fairly obscure language, aren't they?
Yeah, they're written in what we call the old ancient language of acronyms. So everything pretty much on a record of service, apart from a station name, was written as an acronym. So some of them are well known, SQM, Squadron, FLT, Flight. But in the Second World War especially, there were thousands of different units, all with their own acronyms, many of which have been, not been used literally for decades. And some of these were pretty obscure. I mean, the RAF had strange units like canal defence flights and mosquito suppression flights. They weren't suppressing mosquito aeroplanes, they were suppressing nasty little insects that gave you malaria. So we have to try and interpret all those and go back to people saying this is what this record of service contains. And of course, we'll also tell them what the guy did, what his trade was, and to a degree, what he was doing. Although the records of service are not very informative, they will tell you what a guy's trade was and they will tell you what unit he was on, but they won't have any great detail on the actual physical work that he was doing. But yeah, that's what we do. We then send them back and say, this is the history of your relative. And we advise that they can then go, of course, to the National Archive at Kew if they're sufficiently enthusiastic and go and look up the Ops record book and see what it says about great Uncle Fred.
So it's the beginning of a journey. I'm guessing as well, if we look at more recent times, if we look at how many people claim to have been on the balcony at the Iranian embassy siege, there were about 4,500 people. Do you have similar things with people claiming things that they didn't do?
Yes, we do. There appear to have been several thousand guys on the Dams raid. There appear to have been far more than the 3,000 aircrew that we know took part in the Battle of Britain. There appear to have been far more than we have the names of all the guys in the Battle of Britain, just as we have all the names who were on the Dams raid. But yeah, I mean, we know people, especially if they get into the Royal British Legion bar or something, then, all stories expand with the telling. Some of them, Spitfire pilots in the Battle of Britain is the most common, and it turns out that actually Great Uncle Fred was, a fitter airframes up in Scotland. Or one of the more famous ones was the guy who had a very exotic story involving, flying out and dropping into France by parachute and all the rest of it. But he served the entire war as a cook in Wales.
Which was contributing, but he wasn't doing what he was claiming to be doing.
Absolutely. When we write back, and I tend to get the ones where, we call them the Wtim Mitties. Well, the staff give those to
Thank
me.
you. Yeah.
Thanks very much. And I do try and say, look, his war was perfectly honourable. Just because he wasn't flying a Spitfire in the Battle of Britain doesn't mean that it wasn't an honourable war. The saddest one I got was a family sent the record of service, and they said they couldn't understand it because they thought he was a Spitfire pilot. Well, he wasn't. But what he was a gunner in Bomber Command, and he'd served 1.5 full tours on bombers. So 1 tour on Bomber Command in the UK, and he was then sent to the Middle East. He's flying on Liberators in the Middle East. His aircraft crashes. He climbs out onto the upper wing, jumps over a turning engine and breaks his leg. And he obviously broke it very badly, and they obviously didn't do a great job of putting it back together, because eventually he's casevaced back to the UK, and then he's discharged from the Air Force as unfit for further service. So I wrote back to the relative and said, look, I don't know why he didn't tell you what his actual war was, because A, it's just as, if not more dangerous than being a Spitfire pilot. B, it's extremely honourable, and he served his country very well. And, C, I have no idea why he wanted to claim to be a Spitfire pilot, because actually his job was just as important and rather more difficult. I didn't hear anything for about 6 months. And then they finally wrote back, and the family said, well, thank you. Thank you. My brother and I are very grateful for your letter. We were very shocked by it and very upset at first and couldn't understand it and why Dad had told us all this nonsense. But then we thought about what you'd said, about his honourable war. And then even more tragically, they ended the letter by saying, yes, we knew about his leg because once he left the RAF, he had endless trouble with it and eventually he had to have his leg amputated.
Wow.
So this poor guy...
45 missions in Bomber Command.
Yeah, not only done 1.5 tours on bombers, the chances of surviving which are about 50-50, depending on the time of the war, but not great. But then he's been badly injured in the service of his country and had to have his leg chopped off. But he wanted to claim he was a Spitfire pilot. I just found it immensely sad.
I guess we're lost in the mist of time, but...
Yeah, they did eventually... come round to thinking, having initially been quite cross with him, I think, to accepting that actually his war was just as honourable as any Spitfire pilot's. So yeah, they do, there are the Wtim Mitties.
And you get them in every trade and every walk of life, I guess. But
you do.
Seb Cox, the head of the Air Historical Branch. If somebody listening to this has had their interest piqued, obviously keep the Form 540s going in. There's no detail that's too small or too inconsequential, I guess, for those. But if somebody wants to find out a bit more and start looking at this, is there a website or something they can look at?
Well, as I said, there's the website on which we put all copies of all our histories going back to the Second World War. But they can also either write to us at RAF Northolt, or they can send an email. We have an external email, which is essentially ahb.raf@btconnect.com.
Just give us that address again, so we've got that.
ahb.raf@btconnect.com.
Okay, I'll put that onto the site as well. So that's a good starting point for this. What's next for you? What's next on your entry, or next in your entry, Seb?
Well, finally, Chris, I have concluded that after 28 years as the head of AHB and 40 years in the branch, it's probably time I finally retired. So I'm going to retire in January. But before I go, we still have work to do. As I say, we've got a Lancaster in Germany and a Hurricane in France, and we've got histories to write. And we still get questions both from the Air Force and from the great British, and not just the British public. We get emails from all over the world, of course. So
the good work will continue. Happy retirement to you. What will you miss most about being part of AHB on a daily basis?
Interesting question. I think it is just every day in this office is different. You never quite know when you come into the office in the morning what email you're going to open or phone call you're going to get asking a question that you were not expecting, or being asked to do something that you hadn't actually considered. And life is always full of surprises in AHB. That I can absolutely guarantee. And it won't be any different for my successor, whoever he or she may be.
Seb Cox, head of the Air Historic Branch, AHB, based at RAF Northolt. Thanks for taking the time to talk to Inside Air.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for asking.
Hi, I'm AS1 Emma Kerwin, and this is Reheat, where we take a look back at some of the RAF stories you might have missed. The initial phase of work to prepare RAF Lakenheath for US Air Force F-35 aircraft has been completed. The official opening of the corrosion control facility has taken place. It sees F-35 sprayed with a protective coating. A rare Dornier Dio 17 German aircraft wing section will go on display at RAF Museum Midlands in Cosford early next year. It's been salvaged after more than 70 years submerged beneath the waters of the Goodwin Sands in the Thames estuary. Nicknamed the Flying Pencil, it played a vital role for Germany in the early stages of the Second World War and is best remembered for its involvement in the Battle of Britain. Air Vice Marshal Ranald Munro's become the first part-time volunteer reserve 2-star officer to have the honour of reviewing a full RAF officers' graduation parade at RAF Cranwell. It was a landmark moment for the Royal Auxiliary Air Force, The parade saw the formal graduation of 26 officer cadets from the modular initial officer training course number 30 and 12 officer cadets from the reserve officer initial training course number 72. RAF personnel were among those who volunteered at the London Poppy Day. The event marked the start of the Royal British Legion's annual Poppy Appeal. As a show of unity, more than 1,000 uniformed personnel from the Royal Navy, British Army and of course Royal Air Force, alongside 1,000 additional veterans and volunteers took part. And RAF reservist AS2 Chris Keane is providing behind-the-scenes footage of what life is like on the basic recruit training course. He's doing a series on the RAF's YouTube channel to try to encourage people to join the RAF.
Everyone on this course just seems really switched on, and we're in it together, already working as a team. So tonight we've done a lot of block jobs, we've done all the hoovering, we've been around the skirting boards, we've been on top of the lockers, polishing and mopping and dusting and doing all the fun jobs, ready for our first inspection tomorrow morning.
You're up to date on Inside Air.
Thanks, Emma. And now it's time to find out who's under the hat with Ben.
I'm AS1 Ben Russell, and this is Under the Hat, where we get to know an aviator in less than a minute. Name you're known by.
Hi, I'm Squadron Leader Carey.
What's your profession?
I'm the Media and Engagement Lead for ISR Future Capability aircraft covering Wedgetail, Protector, Shadow Mark II and Poseidon Futures. I'm based at Air Command, RAF High Wycombe.
What's the best thing about your job?
The best thing about my role is the variety of events and activities that I run across the ISR programs to maintain the profile of these aircraft as they head towards their in-service dates.
Hardest part of your job?
The hardest part of my role is managing a varied and often changing schedule which can affect my ability to promote key milestones in these programs.
Best location you've served?
My favourite locations have been in the Middle East, including Kuwait and Oman, as they really provide a sense of being on operations.
And what's your proudest moment in the RAF?
The proudest moment of my RAF career was planning and delivering a media event for the last known Battle of Britain pilot, Paddy Hemingway, in Dublin, Ireland, where he was reunited with a BBMF Hurricane, an aircraft he flew in World War II but had not seen for over 50 years. Seeing him listen to the Merlin engine roar into life was very special.
Thank you, Squadron Leader Carey, for being the latest aviator to take part in Under the Hat.
That's all for this episode of Inside Air. Please give us a review, subscribe on your favourite podcast app, and join us again soon.
You've been listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations. If you're serving in the RAF and have a story for us, please speak to your unit media and communications officer. Inside Air is written and produced for the Royal Air Force by RAF Media Reserves.